It's become a recent trend throughout the abortion debate to try and show that the Bible has an informing attitude towards abortion. The point of this video is to show why this claim is mistaken. The first point to note is that those who argue that the Bible is not pro-life are often committing an equivocation fallacy. An equivocation fallacy is when one uses the same term in different ways throughout an argument. For instance, suppose I said Socrates was Greek, Greek is a language, therefore Socrates is a language. This is an equivocation fallacy because it uses Greek in two different senses. The reason this is relevant is because this is exactly what some pro-choice advocates are doing with the word pro-life when they make arguments from the Bible. In the abortion debate, to say one is pro-life is to say you are against the act of aborting a pregnancy. Pro-life does not mean that one thinks life should never be intentionally ended under any circumstances. However, when pro-choice advocates say God killed a bunch of people in this verse, therefore he is not pro-life, they are clearly using pro-life to mean something different from what it means in the abortion debate. This brings me to my second philosophical point, which is that one can believe that life has intrinsic moral value while also believing that there are instances in which it is morally justified for us to intentionally end a life. For instance, most people agree that it is wrong to walk into a school and start shooting kids. However, most people would also agree that it is morally acceptable to use lethal force against a mass shooter. The fact that I think it's okay to use lethal force against the mass shooter doesn't contradict my claim that I think all life has intrinsic value. This nuance is missed by pro-choice advocates who search through scripture, find an instance in which God kills somebody, and then say, aha, you can't claim your God is against killing babies in the womb because he killed people right here. The fact that God has killed people in scripture doesn't contradict the belief that God does not want us to kill babies in the womb willy-nilly. This brings me to the next philosophical issue, which is that pro-choice advocates fail to recognize that a moral agent's relationship to a person or object can make a difference in the morality of that action. For instance, if I smash my car window, that's not immoral. If you smash my car window, that is immoral. It's the same action, but the morality of the act is different because we have different moral obligations. I don't have the same moral obligation to not destroy my property as you do. This is a relevant distinction to make because in a similar manner, just because we have a moral obligation not to do something does not mean that God does not have a moral obligation not to do something. If God, as the author and sovereign king of all creation, chooses to end someone's life, Christians believe that that is his prerogative, as all life is a gift from him, and he has no moral obligation to sustain our lives at any moment. The fact that God does not have a moral obligation to sustain a person's life does not change or undercut the fact that we as humans have a moral obligation to not kill each other willy-nilly. Thus, all of these attempts by pro-choice advocates to find instances in which God kills a person, even a person we might consider innocent, they completely miss the mark. It's also important to know that just because the biblical author narrates an event does not mean the author approves of that event. I see people referencing various accounts in Second Kings in which a ruler is described as killing pregnant women as a source of argument. An example of this is Second Kings 5:16, in which we are told a ruler ripped open pregnant women and killed their babies. But all this verse gives is a narration of the event, not the moral status of the action. If you want to see the moral status of the action, you might want to look at Second Kings 5:12, in which we are explicitly told that the prophet Elijah is upset by this action because it's so evil. Similarly, many of the verses coming from the prophetic books are describing what will happen to a nation at the hands of an invading army. I've seen Hosea 13:16 used in argument because it describes little ones being dashed open and pregnant women being ripped open. This verse is referring to the fate that the people will suffer at the hands of the invading Assyrian army, and it by no means condones the actions described. It would be asinine to argue that the Bible is okay with the widespread use of these actions just because God allows them to happen or to befall his people as a punishment for disobedience. With these philosophical notes in mind, most of the text used to argue that the Bible is pro-choice vanish. Almost all the verses usually cited by the pro-choice position are instances in which people are being put to death as a consequence for wickedness. Sometimes this is at the hand of God, sometimes it's at the hands of God's people, and sometimes it's at the hands of an invading army. Regardless, none of these verses contradict the pro-life belief that it is wrong for us to kill babies in the womb anytime we so desire. Once the above philosophical notes are considered, the only two verses that remain for the pro-choice advocate are Numbers 5:11 through 31 and Exodus 21:22 through 25, which I'll turn my attention to now. It's become popular for pro-choice advocates to cite Numbers 5 as an instruction manual for abortion, or God-sanctioned abortion. In this verse, a ritual is described in which a man who suspects his wife of infidelity can bring her before God and have her tested. In this test, she takes an oath before God and drinks what is described as bitter water. If she is guilty, we are told that her womb will swell and her thigh will fall away. Pro-choice advocates interpret the text referring to her thigh falling away as the abortion of a child she is carrying. However, a careful examination of the academic literature regarding this verse shows that we should not be quick to this interpretation. First, as virtually every paper published on this verse notes, the Hebrew used to describe the curse of the guilty woman is obscure and difficult to translate. This is unfortunately the case sometimes when dealing with ancient documents in ancient languages. We sometimes have words or phrases that we rarely see elsewhere that make interpretation difficult, though not necessarily impossible. In the case of Numbers 5, many scholars believe the curse befalling the adulterous woman is not miscarriage, but sterility. For instance, in his paper titled The Suspected Sota, Trikva Freimer-Kinsky, whose name I can only hope I have pronounced correctly, argues based on the Hebrew that the most probable meaning of the curse befalling the woman is that she suffers from a prolapsed uterus, which would result in sterility. Even if the case in question is a miscarriage, which again is uncertain, it's hard to see how this could be used to argue that the Bible had an affirming view of abortion. This type of procedure was only used in specific instances in which infidelity was committed, and God was the agent that caused the curse, not man. Here I will remind the listener to the philosophical point that God has moral liberty when it comes to killing that we do not. I will also note that failing the test brought shame and disgrace to the woman in question, which is in contrast to the supposedly affirming view of abortion we are supposed to get from this text. Another verse that supposedly provides support for viewing the fetus with low moral status is Exodus 21:22-25, which states in the Hebrew that if two men are fighting and one hits a pregnant woman, causing her child to come out, and there is no harm, he should pay a fine. However, if he hits a pregnant woman and the child comes out and there is harm, the punishment is death. Some have used this to argue that the fetus was not considered alive because all that the wrongdoer had to suffer was a fine. However, interpretation of this text is not so simple. It is not clear if harm in the Hebrew is referring to harm to the woman or harm to the fetus. However, we don't have to sit around and wonder. The Hebrew Old Testament was later translated into Greek, and it was this Greek translation of the Old Testament that was primarily used in the first century. In fact, it is often the case that modern scholars defer to the Greek translation over the Masoretic text when dealing with textual issues. In the Greek translation, the word used instead of harm is formed. In this reading, the impression given is that if the miscarriage that comes out is not formed, a fine is sufficient to make amends. However, if the miscarriage which comes out shows a formed child, the penalty is death. The reason for this is because in the last case, a life was lost, and as verse 23 says, you should pay a life for a life. The early Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria discusses this exact passage and suggests this exact meaning in his discussion of the verse. He says, quote, "But if the offspring is already shaped and all the limbs have their proper qualities and places in the system, he must die, for that which answers to this description is a human being, which he has destroyed in the laboratory of nature." This brings me to my final point in regard to passages like Exodus 22 and Numbers 5:11, which is that if these verses in fact show that the biblical authors were okay with abortion, why is it the case that the consensus of early Christian writings are against abortion? Are we to believe that the English speaking 21st century pro choice advocate has a better understanding of the Bible's view of abortion than those who lived in the culture and spoke the language it was written in? This is at best ignorant and at worst arrogant. In conclusion, pro choice advocates are mistaken to think the Bible supports their position. The scriptures they often cite are taken out of context and used sloppily with no philosophical nuance. If you think there is a scripture that I didn't mention that does not fall prey to the philosophical issues I noted earlier, feel free to comment it and I will try to make a shorter video regarding it.